welcome everyone to this session. I hope you enjoyed the ODI Summit 2021 so far. As Nanga said, this session will be about nudging our behavior and what the role of data and access to it in particular plays in creating happier, healthier, and greener communities. I'm joined in this conversation by two great speakers, Elisabeth Costa, Senior Director, Policy and Partnerships at the Behavioural Insight Team, and Lisa O'Keefe, Executive Director of Insight at Sport England. Before we go into the conversation, one word about the reason why behaviour is so important. If we think about the challenges that Naga just mentioned, such as fighting a global pandemic or reaching net zero, very much at the forefront of conversation happening at the COP in Glasgow, or even just simply, but really importantly, how can we ensure that people prioritize their well-being? All those topics actually, in a way or the other, connect to the idea of changing the way we do things and therefore our behaviors. This is particularly important, and also it's important in the context of allowing people to have the right data and therefore derive the right information in order to take these decisions and change their behavior. Just to give you a very practical example, there was a study run in North Carolina where people were commuting, and they were commuting to work, were given different suggestions on how to take routes and a set of transport connections that were greener than their usual ones. And they were provided with this information in an easy way. Those that did were 12% more likely to actually take greener commuting routes. And so changing their behavior was not just easier, but also relevant to them. So I'm very excited about this conversation where we will be unpacking some of these topics. So thank you so much, Elisabeth and Lisa, for joining us in this conversation. Really pleased that you accepted our invite.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Elisabeth, I'd like to start with you because the Behavioural Insight team generates and applies behavioural insight to inform policies and also improve public services. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is behavioural science and what kind of behaviours can be changed by providing information, access to information, and which others needs other kind of incentives?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Orsola. Hi, I'm Liz Costa from the Behavioural Insights team. So BIT was set up in 2010, and it was really set up with a dual mission. So the first part of that mission was to apply a more realistic model of human behaviour to public policy. And by that, we mean a model that draws on decades of academic research about how people make decisions, and particularly the systematic errors and biases that are present in people's decision-making and choices. And the second part of our mission was to use data and experimentation to robustly evaluate what works to shift people's behaviour. So we have a rich amount of information about that at this stage. And really all of these behaviours that we're talking about today, these issues we're talking about today, rather, are behavioural in nature. So to take net zero as an example, the Committee on Climate Change recently said that 62% of the UK's emissions reductions will need to come from behaviour change. So what we need is a really sophisticated understanding of how people are making decisions, what are the behavioural barriers to people taking action in these areas, and what are the types of behavioural interventions we might design and implement and evaluate in order to shift people's behaviours.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. This is really important. And in a way, a good segue to my question, my following question, which is to both of you. You prompt, Elisabeth, the relationship between information and data, which is also very much at the core of the Open Data Institute's theory of change. You need data in order to allow people to make sense of it and therefore turn that into information, which then drives decisions and behaviors. How does data underpin access to information in your experience and in the work that you do in your organizations? And perhaps, Lisa, we can start from you this time.
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much for the invite today. So Sport England, our reason for being and our mission is to work with others to try and make sport and physical activity a normal part of everybody's lives. And of course, for many, that will require quite a significant behaviour change. And we also know that for those people who are active throughout their life, they come in and out of lots of different activities. So that change happens all the time when it comes to sport and physical activity. And it sounds really obvious, but if we are to help change behaviour, we need to understand current behaviour and what drives it. And from Sport England's perspective, I would say for a lot of years, what we did very well was we captured the picture of people's behaviour. We knew a lot about what people were doing, where they were doing it. But over the last few years in particular, we've worked really hard to understand why and what's driving that behaviour. And that, for me, is where we move from data to information to insight. So rather than collecting a lot of data, which we do, and we publish it all on our website, and if you want the data tables, help yourself. What we do a lot more of these days is produce the reports which really set the context, tell the story of people's lives and how they're behaving and why. And we also keep on kind of pushing our understanding. And particularly, actually, as interesting what Elisabeth was saying about behavioural science, because we quite quickly kind of grasped that for us, using some of our research tools and our surveys to really understand those behaviours and test some of those behavioural theories was going to be quite important to understanding how we could diagnose what was happening and help advise others. So we are a big fan of behavioural science, and in fact the COM-B behavioural model is one which sits at the heart of an awful lot of our thinking. And when you look at all of the Sport England information and insights, it talks a lot about the importance of capability, opportunity and motivation, and the way in which they interplay to drive the behaviours that we exhibit when it comes to sport and physical activity.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Elisabeth, what is your experience in the relationship between data and information?
Well, I think Lisa and I are very aligned here, and I agree with her entirely. I think that sort of continuum of data to information to insight is a great way to think about it. And if we're thinking about that through the lens of behaviour change, we use data to understand how people are behaving at the moment. You know, what are the barriers and motivations to their behaviour? And try and really understand what the target should be for any intervention. We turn that into information. We often use information in our interventions, so giving people feedback or specific pieces of information to try and shift their behaviour. And then we use data and experimentation to generate insights about what works to shift behaviour, to what extent, for whom, and I think then the loop continues.
Absolutely. And if we think about, in practical terms, what giving access to information looks like for someone in an organization, we really understand what a key role individuals and people play in this process. Elisa, I know that yourself and Sport England last year at the beginning of the pandemic were facing precisely these challenges. And you and some other members of your team had to actually reflect on whether to make some data and information available to people and which one. Can you tell us a little bit more about the process, how you navigated it and what you decided to do in the end?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for us at Sport England, it's slightly different in that it's important for us that we help our whole sector, our whole industry, make better decisions. And I truly believe, as you'd expect, that data, information and insight is at the heart of that. I guess for some people on this call, the question may be, do I invest resource in gathering that data, creating information and drawing out the insights? Because that is a resource challenge. I would argue that it's absolutely critical to making better decisions. At the start of the pandemic, actually, we went through quite a journey in that some people may know that we produce every 6 months our Active Lives survey, which is multi-years of samples of 200,000 adults and what they're doing and why they're behaving in a way that they are. But it looks back. It's always got that 6-month look back. And of course, suddenly in the pandemic, people were wanting to know what's happening today, immediately. And that made us think hard about how we could add to that, how we could produce weekly trackers, and monthly trackers to supplement that information. And it was a decision about whether or not we made that available. I mean, I'll be honest, if you're Sport England and you put information out about how active people are, the first question people ask is, well, what are you doing about it, Sport England? I would argue, certainly in our case, that is the right thing to do because it allows many others to understand the challenge and make better decisions. So it's a small price to pay in order to make that information available to others. As the pandemic went on, to be honest, we moved from producing weekly trackers, which we circulated, to packaging those up into insight reports, and again, sharing all of this freely on our website. And we just really kind of upped our game, I guess, in terms of how quickly we're producing that information and the extent to which we were really trying to get under the skin of how people were thinking and feeling, and the extent to which that was changing so quickly.
That's a remarkable approach, and also very quick response to something that no one would have ever been able to predict. So this is looking at the providing access to data from who holds the data. But if we think about the outcome of making information available and changing behavior on the receiving side, do you have examples or case studies of when providing access to information has benefited someone in ways that then also changed their behavior for the better or for the worse? Elisabeth, I'm going to start with you this time.
I'm going to focus on the examples for the better. So I think there's different categories of giving people information, and I want to talk through a quick example for each one. So the 3 categories I want to highlight are firstly, giving people generalized information. Secondly, using information to correct misperceptions. And thirdly, giving people data-based feedback. So firstly, on the generalized information, I think there's a lot that can be done, particularly, I'll use climate and net zero as an example through these 3. So on generalized information, we've run trials looking at redesigning energy labels, particularly on appliances, and giving people information about things like the lifetime running cost of a washer dryer or a fridge freezer, showing that in a way that's really intuitive and salient and gives people information that can help them overcome the present bias of the choice of how much they're paying for that appliance now versus how much energy it's going to use over the lifetime that they own it. And what we found was that redesigning those labels in that way significantly changed people's purchasing behaviour and encouraged people to purchase more energy efficient appliances. I think there's a lot of potential there in things like nutrition labelling and other fields as well. And then we have information about people's perceptions about behaviour change. So again, on net zero, it's really interesting in the context of COP26 to think about what people believe they can do to contribute to net zero. And in many cases, those beliefs are poorly calibrated. So, for example, the majority of people think that the most impactful thing they can do is to increase their recycling, when in fact, the impact of increasing recycling on emissions is very low, about 0.2 tonnes over a year. Whereas not having a car is about 2.4 tonnes, and people really underestimate the impact of not having a car. In fact, the most impactful thing people can do, which is quite controversial, is to have one less child. And that is, from a emissions perspective, the most impactful thing. But it's interesting to think about how we can use that type of data to recalibrate people's perceptions about what it is they can do individually and the impact of that. And then I think you move on to using data to give people personalised data-based feedback. So there's some very classic studies on energy use, a company called O-Power, where what they did was give people the feedback on their own energy consumption in kilowatt hours, but they also compared that to the energy consumption of their most efficient neighbours and told them, how they were doing compared to their neighbours. And what we saw as a result of that intervention was a sustained decrease in household energy consumption of about 2%. And it persists and it's replicated very strongly in lots of different cultural contexts as well. And again, I think many applications for that kind of data-based feedback in climate, in health, in happiness, and other policy areas as well.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Those are great examples that I'm sure the majority of us can relate to. Elisa, I'm keen to hear now from you any other example from either your experience or things that Sport England has been doing.
Yeah, well, I was actually thinking of, it's a relatively small example as Elisabeth was talking there, but I think it's a really good example of how we've developed our thinking when it comes to the use of data in applications. So, I spoke earlier about the importance, if you want somebody to behave in a particular way, in our case, we would like people to be active, right? Regularly active. And if, as the data shows, if feeling able to do that activity, having an opportunity, the appropriate opportunity to take part, and that opportunity delivering on what motivates you, what's important to you. If those three factors are important to creating that behaviour, I think an awful lot of the time we kind of default to opportunity. We think, let's create the opportunity for people to start build it and they will come. And if I think about some of the work that we've done with activity trackers, it's an interesting example of how we've moved and developed our thinking. When we first started this, we actually thought quite naively, well, we'll build an activity tracker that shows people what opportunities are out there. We'll put it on the Sport England platform. And of course, the reality is it's very costly. It very quickly goes out of date. And actually, it's only part of that dynamic. As time has moved on, we've learned the importance of building activity trackers through open data, through providing opportunities for other providers to use their data and bring that data to the platform so that it really does grow and it's kept fresh and up to date. I think the big development that recently we've managed to create in thinking about trackers, because we know ability, that capability, and we know motivation are really important. The This Girl Can campaign, we created a tracker on our website there, and it's not based on, you know, can I find where can I take part in badminton? That wouldn't be the question you would ask, because we know with this audience that often for many of the women who are attracted by the campaign, they've maybe not taken part in sports since they left school. And you don't know what you don't know in terms of the opportunities out there. So we've created a tracker which is based on how people feel. How do you want to feel? What is it you want to get from that experience? And I'm really sort of delving into those emotional feelings of being active. And that's what the tracker is all about. And that will then lead you through into opportunities. And I think it's just a really good example of how our understanding of the components of what shapes our behaviour and what drives that behaviour has really moved our thinking on, in terms of how we try to provide solutions that make it easier for people to find the right opportunity for them.
Absolutely, and it's very nuanced. And thank you for giving us a little bit more in-depth insight into that. We're now opening the floor to the audience, and I can already see some questions coming in. Please keep them coming in the chat also, because we won't have time to take many of them. So first come, first served. Elisabeth, I've got a question for you about nudging. Because I know that the behavioral insight team does a lot of work with nudge theory. Someone from the audience asks, nudging to some extent assumes people are already engaged enough to nudge. How do we get data about and engage members of the community who are currently disengaged, face cultural barriers, or are otherwise hard to reach? Really important question, and very keen to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think when we're looking at information-based interventions of the type that we're talking about today, they do rely on some engagement from the people whose behaviour you're trying to shift. And that in many ways is a limiting factor of their impact, because in order for somebody to change their behaviour based on the design of an energy label, for example, you need them to be reading, comprehending, and engaging with that energy label. So it is one of the tools in our toolkit. It's not the only tool. I would say that the holy grail really, and the first law of behavioral science is to make it easy. So as wherever possible, we try and make the behavior that we're trying to encourage as easy as possible. And often that involves not giving people information, but changing the system in which they're making the choice. So, making it as easy as possible to, let's take a concrete example. So if we're looking to encourage people to reduce their sugar consumption, for example, there are many ways to give them information about the nutritional components of different foods and their diet overall. But one of the most successful interventions in the last decade has been the sugar levy. And what the impact of the sugar levy was that manufacturers of drinks reformulated their drinks to reduce the sugar content. So without having people change their behavior, without having them drink less Coke or less iron brew, they were actually taking significant amounts of sugar out of their diet. And one of the things we're really focused on is, what are those interventions that change that system and choice environment, make it as easy as possible for people?
Can I come in on that one as well? Because I think it's just such an important point that Elisabeth makes there, because often we default to thinking about the individual being the one who has to change. And that is something we've learned so clearly at Sport England, that we don't make decisions in a vacuum, do we? I mean, you know, we all know we should move more. We all understand that. But the barriers which stop us can be quite complex, and they are shaped by the world around us. And until we understand that and really use data and information and insight to understand how that system around people really does shape the choices that they make, we're kind of missing the point, and we are less likely to be successful in our attempts to change in behaviour. And that's why so much of our work now is done in a place, because we know we can work with the right organisations and the communities and understand the interplay of all those different elements of that system around them, and how in a kind of coordinated way we can create an environment where it is, you know, people feel more able to be active. And as I say, moving away from thinking about the individual and thinking about that system is just critical to success here.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And without wanting, you actually answered the question that has just come in, which was from someone asking, to what extent is nudging actually a question that needs to be addressed by a community, by different agencies coming together? And I think you provided an answer to that. So whoever asked the question, we were prompt to the answer straight away. I've got another question from the audience, which I think, Lisa, you would be quite well placed to answer, and it's about trust. So to what extent is source information when feeding back or gathering information? How do we ensure trust in the data we provide or in the data gathering process? And as Sport England, you described the journey that you went through in collecting, using, and making available the data. How did you think about trust, if any? I mean, I know that you have thought about it. So what is your perspective around the trust in the data, and then how you communicate that further down the line?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's so important, isn't it? And yes, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we ensure that the data that we collect, frankly, it's good data. And we talk actually a lot also to partners about the importance of good data governance and data standards. Because it's one thing ensuring that what we produce at Sport England is of the right quality, and you know, people can rely that it's been collected in the right way and it's been processed in the right way. I think the big win for all of us collectively is getting to a place where we're working to the same standards, so that we can bring those data sets together and build that picture of understanding. And that's a different kind of trust, because that's the trust which says, you know, I trust in giving you access to this data and information, which, you know, there is a resource implication to it. But I trust that in collaborating with you, we will find the right, you know, better answers, better solutions to big challenges. And that is the sort of trust that I think is the one that's really important for us all now. We've all got oodles of data, haven't we? But it's how we use that together to really get to the bottom of some of the big challenges that we all face and find better solutions.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We are approaching almost the end of our discussion, but I'm very keen to leave the audience with something practical that they can implement tomorrow, next month, before the end of the year from your experience. If you were to give your top tip on how an organization or an individual seeing this conversation within an organization, what can they do in order to think about either providing access to information and therefore contributing towards achieving some of these challenges, solving some problems they're facing. Elisabeth, maybe we start with you and then we close with Lisa.
Sure. Look, what I would encourage people to do is use your data to understand the complexity of problems. So don't look at behaviour change just at the aggregate level, but think about how you can use your data to understand what is happening for different segments of the population or different segments of the people you're working with, and try and work out a solution that doesn't just work in the aggregate, but works for each of those groups of people, and understand why that is.
Thank you, Elisabeth. What's your top tip, Lisa?
Can I have two? My first one would be is just make it really simple, make it easy for people to understand and interpret the data, because that's the first stumbling block. And then the second one I would say is, ultimately, I believe strongly that the open data sits at the heart of all of this. And if there was one thing you're going to do today, if you understand open data, is think about who in your organization would benefit from understanding the importance of open data and its power, because really getting advocates for this will be important in your organization if you're to open up data sources and allow others in.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Elisabeth, for joining me in these very interesting conversations. Thank you to everyone watching this. I wish you an enjoyable and insightful rest of the summit.